Welcome to A Moment of Bach, where we take our favorite moments from the composer's vast musical output, just a minute's worth, or even a few seconds, and show you why we think they are remarkable. We are your hosts, Christian and Alex Giebert. On this episode, we hear a moment from the beginning of the cantata, Liebster Gott, wenn, sterben. Time waits for no one, or time and tide wait for no man, quote from Geoffrey Chaucer. Chaucer probably wasn't the first one to express this sentiment, however. Anytime you hear a ticking clock, you are either reminded of, what time it is currently, if you're a practical person, or you're reminded of the ephemerality of life and the ever closer inching toward death, if you're a philosophical person, I suppose. Maybe a nicer way to look at it would be that the ticking of the clock is measuring the opportunities that you have to make a positive difference in your life. No matter how you look at it, it really doesn't matter. At least the clock doesn't care what you think. And it ticks on. And in this opening chorus for the cantata for today, we can argue about what this repeated note in the high recorder is supposed to signify. But I think a clock might be it. The first line, Liebster Gott, wenn ich sterben? Dearest God, when shall I die? The rest of the verse about how we are heirs of Adam. In the Lutheran doctrine, that means we are sinners because Adam was the first sinner, and our inheritance from Adam is sin. The verse ends with, we are poor and wretched on earth, and then become earth ourselves. This is going to come back at the end of the cantata in a more hopeful way, as these cantatas normally do. They morph from law into gospel, and by the end they are a lot more promising in tone. In the second movement, a tenor aria, we get, why, my spirit, would you be fearful when my final hour strikes? The end of the alto recitative brings us this really interesting resolution of a flat sixth scale degree down to a fifth scale degree. It's actually not. It's not in the score.
In the score.
Yeah, he makes the choice there, the countertenor who sings this, which is a cool choice. And gives it almost an alien, unearthly quality. It's a legal thing. It's an accented appoggiatura tone. It's okay to do it if you immediately move on the next beat back to the correct tone.
Right.
And then after that, we get quite a contrast into this next aria, a bass aria that starts with just this absolutely delightful jig. Makes me want to go hunting on a horse kind of jig, you know? You get the recorder playing along above the other instruments, and you can hear that this is actually a recorder obligato line once the recorder starts getting some more interesting music here.
And in octaves with the violin one
it's cool.
For a second.
Cool orchestration. And the recorder gets a long note, high B for a while, before it gets to run along with its fancy filigree after that. It's kind of a long instrumental introduction. It's 16 bars, but these are long measures. And it's just unabashedly happy. So what could the text be that we've gotten to this point with the music? Well, the text, "But vanish, you foolish vain worries. My Jesus calls me, who would then not go?" Nothing that I desire is of this world. Appear to me, blessed, happy morning. Transfigured and glorious before Jesus, I'll stand. Really nice poetry. Of course, that sounds even nicer in German, with the rhythm of the text and the rhyming and everything. The next movement is a soprano recitative in which she declares that the world can keep anything that was hers, because what she carries is the greatest blessing, which is the faith that she has in God, because that is renewed each morning and is unkillable. You get the word sterben again. Man kann nicht sterben at the end of this recitative. It cannot die. Even though it's like a negative on the word death, cannot die, Bach still can't resist giving the word sterben a little bit of spice here, like he likes to do. Then, in the final chorale, we get as we do in most of these cantatas, we get the gospel exposition of what we've been talking about this whole time. Let at last my end be good. Lehre mich den Geist aufgeben. Like, that literally means giving up the spirit, give up the ghost, right?
Give up the ghost.
Give up the ghost with courage. The poet then talks about going to the grave unfearing, basically. So what else might happen when a clock strikes an hour? You might hear something else besides ticking. What might you hear?
Bell?
Yeah. It's not a trick question. And sometimes bells call people to church. Sometimes bells call people to funerals. Certain numbers of times bells were rung might call people to a funeral. In this first movement, we have those little repeated notes in the recorder. There are 4 groups of 6 notes each, 24 notes. "24 being the number of times a funeral bell was rung in Leipzig. Now, the 24 could also represent something else, right? But the description for this cantata on Netherlands Bach Society's website, of course, that is the group whose recording we've been listening to during this podcast episode. That description speaks of bells as the potential meaning of this really unique word painting that's happening here in the recorder part. They mention that this does not sound like a big church bell. Well, that's for sure. It's one of the highest notes that we can hear in a typical Baroque instrumentation. Instead, they say it's probably meant to represent a small handbell, a Loretto or St. Anthony bell that was used when someone lay on their deathbed, as they say in the description. And ringing that bell was supposed to drive away evil spirits.
Yeah, because that pitch would equal a bell that is maybe like 1.5 inches in diameter.
Yep.
Or it's a couple centimeters.
It absolutely would have sounded like that. And if you can picture a small handbell that can be shaken and the clapper inside will make several notes, right? To be clear, we're not talking about the like English handbell style clapper or American handbell style clapper that any handbell ringers of the more modern instrument of handbells.
That's a modern invention.
Yeah, it might be familiar with. It's more of a modern invention with the way that clapper works, and it's more like controllable, and you can make a lot more, really interesting tonal music on that. But these would have been handheld bells with a freely moving clapper inside, probably also made of metal, so that it would have sounded like that, right? Like a shake. of a bell.
It could have even been like a Crotal thing with like a more enclosed jingle. Like,
It could have.
but to make a regular beating like dut 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 dut, it probably had to have a clapper and an open.
Well, yes, but
shoulder.
but it might just be that regular beating is the musical approximation that Bach is able to make, because he's not going to be able to write out a random rhythm. You know what I mean?
Or he's writing the artistic interpretation of the crunchiness of a bell tone. Because
Right.
in those days, bells didn't have the technology to be so pure in tone as they do now. So maybe this little bell was actually kind of clashy in its tone. And that's what he's imitating, a beating, like a wobbly dissonance.
Oh,
of
right.
Bells, like internal dissonance in them because of the different overtones and so on.
Yes, that's a good point.
Maybe that's it. Or maybe they actually just played it that fast, and that's exactly how they played it.
Maybe. Or maybe it's just a cool choice by Bach. He wanted to get kind of closer to the bell sound more. Moreover, he wanted to come up with this really interesting orchestrational texture, which is the next thing I want to talk about. We've now talked about the recorder, but what else is going on here? It's unusual, the sound of this, and it has to do with techniques that are specified by Bach. The texture here is 2 oboes d'amore, which is the slightly darker type of Baroque oboe, and those instruments are providing the only legato sound, and that is connected smooth sound, right? There are slurs written in these parts, phrase markings, da 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 da, like this kind of thing. But then the string parts, violin 1, 2, and viola, are marked. In the Urtext version of this, they are marked to be played with mutes and always staccato. And in a different edition I found, it says pizzicato, and we don't have Bach's manuscript for this, but Netherlands Bach Society are making an informed choice here, and they are playing it staccato, but not pizzicato. However, both editions mention pizzicato for the bass line instruments, continuo, and Netherlands Bach Society does this. The cellos, you can see, are playing pizzicato. Which makes those oboes d'amore the only thing with connecting tissue, which is kind of interesting. Because, of course, once the high recorder comes in, that is also staccato. In fact, you might even call it staccatissimo, if you were using the Italian term. Very short. And then, of course, when the choir comes in, they don't sing staccato. That wouldn't have made sense with a chorale melody, especially. So when they sing, the soprano comes in, and that's when the horn enters to beef up the soprano cantus firmus, the sound of the main hymn melody. And then the other voices are under it, singing harmony as is normal. And that's the texture of this. And the thing that I like the most about this, I think, is just the cadence when the flute has the high E's, the cadence that happens right before the choral entrance. Listen to that bass motion leading up to it. Boom, boom, boom. We have A in the bass, the 4 chord, a plagal cadence, A, and then E. Staccato note on E. Boom. Then the entrance of the choir and horn, sopranos and horn. Then the other instruments come back in. I love that little plagal cadence, and he uses that there as well as other times, and right at the end of the movement we hear it again. It's a typical Bach thing that he chooses to set a text which another composer might have decided to go real dark with the music. And instead, what do we have here? It's just absolutely cute, you know? And I'm sure that's on purpose. I mean, I know that when you compare all the styles of music that we are used to hearing today, most classical music sounds like dainty in comparison, if you're going to make broad comparisons, right? I think it's like one of the main reasons why a lot of people don't listen to classical music, because they find it too relaxing or boring or something, and they might not understand all the complexity. That might help to make it more interesting for them if they listened for that. But for this, there's a lot of complexity, but it is dainty and cute. You know, Bach does that understated thing a lot throughout his whole life,
But I think that's why it's one of the reasons why I prefer him over like Beethoven.
Yeah.
Beethoven is so bombastic and over the top, and just like his ego spews forth from the notes. And if you listen to classical music compared to other things that are just like available to listen to these days, maybe it sounds too quiet or understated. But really, it's like classical and romantic music that sounds too overstated to me. And this is what I think is the most noble goal for the composer, is to not take credit through the notes themselves. Like, look, I did this. Look at this accomplishment. And you never get that in Bach.
No, the text speaks for itself in Bach.
There's so many
He's
different
just
reasons.
enlightening the text.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is that he didn't live in an era where that was common. So maybe if he'd lived 100, 150 years later, he would have had more individualism, but also the religious nature of his work. There's a lot of factors that make him that way, but he also just musically preferred it, because he could have easily been just as religious of a composer and sensitive to his themes and wrote something a little scarier for this first movement, which is about death, which is about when will my time of death be, or in many other instances he could have done the same, especially in a lot of his very early Mühlhausen cantatas, where they have light and delicate sweetness to them that is not present in some of his contemporaries or later composers' work.
Right. That's true. Bach is frequently characterized by restraint, and even more so, as you say, in the later years. Which brings me to an interesting fact. We are actually almost at the 300th anniversary of this very cantata. He wrote it in 1724, and it was performed in church in September of 1724, so we are almost at that anniversary. But yeah, I mean, this, you could speak the text of this first verse. When shall I die? My days run ever on. I am one of Adam's heirs. We for a little while are poor and wretched on the earth and become the earth ourselves. It's just so dreary. It's so dark. And then you play this music and you just think, how does this work? And once you see the whole libretto and you see the context of this, and then you see what he's doing with the little bell thing and or you could call it the clock ticking, right? Or maybe the pizzicato was the clock ticking, right? It could be that too. And then it all seems to click into place, so to speak.
And now, here is that moment from the first movement of the cantata Liebster Gott, wenn, ich sterben. If this introduction to a musical moment has encouraged you to explore the rest of this cantata, you can see the full recording on the Netherlands Bach Society website or YouTube. Follow the link in the episode description.
Yes, this is, as we mentioned, a new release from the Netherlands Bach Society, and I'm excited about it because I've always loved this cantata, and I knew they'd get there eventually, and it's a great performance. So, Christian, what's up next week for A Moment of Bach?
We will take a suggestion to look at the Fugue number 4 in C-sharp minor from the Well-Tempered Clavier Book 1.
Until next time, enjoy those moments. Get that bird out of here.